I want to speak from my own experience. Tim mentioned a piece I wrote for The Guardian. I will be gleaning from that a little bit today because it has some good lines and I'm lazy. But I can also say that I do remember where I was when John Hume and David Trimble won their prize, even though I was only 13. I remember it because the Associated Press were there to film it. John Hume and I went to the same school, although admittedly several years apart. So Columns had set up a viewing session where the entire school were crammed into an auditorium to watch goings on in Oslo. And this resurfaced when John passed away. And so a few of my school friends were sending it around and we were spotting each other, and for a very long time I couldn't see myself. And I thought I must have been off that day because I have no memory of it. And then I saw myself just right there at the back. It would be great to say that we were caught up in the joy of the moment, but we did look quite bored in all of the footage, which we didn't appreciate. So, you know, it's a stain on my record that I'm actually filmed looking really, really nonplussed. So I'm glad that I get to repeat or at least to replace that image today. In some ways, I think it was fitting that we were bored. We were sitting there, our civic pride not being caught alight in that moment, because we didn't know it yet, but thanks in no small part to people like John Hume and David Trimble, we had just become the first generation of Northern Irish young people in half a century who could afford to take things like peace for granted. John Hume had, of course, been a fixture in my life for as long as I've been conscious. My earliest memories of him as a politician are from TV. Crumpled suit, ruffled hair, deploying the spiky precision of his speech on local news, or perhaps at the end of a Late Late Show appearance singing Danny Boy. But he was also just someone you might run into in town. Hume was, after all, the world-famous politician who might stop for a chat with your dad as he passed him in a restaurant. Now, nothing blights a child's life like conversations conducted by adults 2 feet above your head. So I wasn't exactly delighted when these things happened. But I also remembered that he would have also been, perhaps, the person who pinned a medal on me at the Feis in this very room 30 years ago. That seemed like such a neat connection to make in this speech that I called my dad last night to see if it could be true. He said it was unlikely that John Hume had pinned an actual medal on me. But it quickly became clear that he didn't mean that John Hume was above such things. He just meant that he couldn't remember me ever winning anything. My father didn't see that potential in me, but I like to think that John Hume did. And for the record, I did win several things, including one in Irish, and I was up against all the Bunskills, so I had to learn it phonetically. I think that counts double. The coverage that rolled around the world after John Hume's passing had a fairly consistent rhythm. You probably can picture it even in your head. Black and white footage of the great civil rights leader on the brick-strewn streets and mossy embankments of early Troubles protests. Thereafter, a burst of colour, propelling him into the future on a flurry of smiles and handshakes into the 90s, and Washington receptions and U2 concerts and speeches to the Nobel Committee. Now, living in London, as I do, and have done for many years, I had to make it clear to my English friends that this kind of montage risked implying the path to peace was a steady, inevitable treadmill. But we know how hard the task of this was, and that the bits in black and white went on a little bit longer than they looked on those footage. I think if there's one thing that people from here are best placed to say, it's this: that if we were to laud John Hume or David Trimble's leadership merely in terms of its benevolence, or their hard graft, or even wisdom, that would be to forget the steel that lay beneath it. In death, there is often a clamour to defang great political leaders, to cast them in moral Play-Doh, all the better for those who are currently in power to squash their lives into little moulds of their own making. Hume should be remembered for his commitment to peaceful protest and unerring denunciation of paramilitary violence, but he should also be applauded for his courage in inviting paramilitaries out of the cold, despite the risk that posed to his career, and also the stakes for David Trimble, likely even higher, something which should not be forgotten by those here today. It was acts of political bravery in his leadership that laid the foundation for the peace that followed. I've written before about my experience of the Good Friday Agreement, and of how once we returned from our Easter break, my history teacher said he gave it 6 months. Now, what could be construed as cynicism might be better understood as hard-won experience of dashed hopes and discarded aspirations. I expect by 6 months he was being generous. He was trying to be optimistic for us. But if he'd made a mark of that deadline, he might have noticed that it was landed just about on the event that we're here to commemorate. Those 6, 7, 8 months later, when David Trimble and John Hume stood up in Oslo. And in Hume's remarks that day, those which stick most with me are the following. Difference is the essence of humanity. Difference is an accident of birth, and it should therefore never be a source of hatred or conflict. The answer to difference is to respect it. Therein lies a most fundamental principle of peace, respect for diversity. We've been talking today about how things have changed in the last 25 years, for the better, for the worse, and I think that at a time when the very fear of this diversity is embraced and indeed weaponized by the political establishment, certainly in the UK, it is striking and sobering to reach back 25 years and find these words so fully and sadly apt to guide us today. My generation was probably not as blown over as our elders by the uneasy normality we now enjoyed. It was to my dad's generation. He was 21 when the Troubles began and 50 when that era ended. By April 1998, he had spent a quarter of a century as a father and had only ever raised his 11 children in a country where violent conflict was routine. Even the eldest in my family had a starker understanding of this gap than I did. They were already adults, living in Bristol, Glasgow, and Nottingham by the time the agreement had been signed. Sometimes when I want to stop myself from taking these things for granted, I have to remind myself that the last time that any of my 3 eldest siblings lived in Northern Ireland, daily killings were a matter of course. The agreement would change our lives, and it would give our generation a sense that the long arc of the moral universe could, in the words of Hume's great hero Martin Luther King, bend towards justice. This was something our parents and even our older siblings might have found hard to believe when they were our age. It gave me personally faith that politics was something changeable and something that real, ordinary people did in the real world, through hard work, applied to difficult things, even being a difficult thing. And Hume and Trimble taught us that leadership meant something, perhaps meant sometimes, perhaps every time, being out on your own and doing the thing that needed doing anyway. And that doing so did not mean you had to close off your heart to the everyday decencies of being a person in the world. That's not to say that me and John always saw eye to eye. Toward the end of my time at St. Colum's as a somewhat rambunctious teenage activist, I earned a rebuke from the great man outside Foylesize, where some comrades and I were loudly protesting the Afghan war. He shared our opposition as it happened, but he was blunt in person about my chances of success in getting that point across if I continued to berate random shoppers who disagreed. Some of those shoppers may well be in this room tonight, and I can only hope you took my enthusiasm as it was intended. I was used to older people telling me that I was going about things all wrong. Young people are. So it's a tribute to the respect I had for him then that I took his point. It's a tribute to John Hume's humanity that shortly afterwards, for the 5th or 6th time in my own remarkable time on this earth, the greatest global statesman of my lifetime shook my hand, inquired after my dad, and asked me how school was getting on. Thanks very much.